Right on. Austin Don's up. He says, for the press release schema, should we just use the organization schema? So it depends on what you mean, Austin Don. If you're talking about for the organization page, the media page within Press Advantage, yes, then I just go with organization schema unless it's for a specific location. For example, like if I've got a multi-location brand for one of my tree service assets, for example, then each one of its own locations is going to get its own separate um, media page in Press Advantage, an organization page. Does that make sense? And so each one of those will get their own location or local business schema markup, structured data markup, right? And that's, again, if that's what you're talking about for the organization page, if you have like a primary brand page, then you could have organization schema within that. But then for each individual location, if there's multiple locations, you would want to have local business schema on that. If you're talking about for a specific press release itself, how to mark that up properly, then no, what you would do in that case, and again, I'm not sure which question it was that you were asking specifically, but technicalseo.com has a schema markup generator tool that you can go and select article markup and then news article. And then what you would do is you would go through here and complete this based upon the details of that particular press release that you're marking up. Here's the idea. Here's a hint though, because I've got this question many times before. People say, well, what is the URL of the press release if you're submitting the structured data markup for the press release before it's been published? You don't have the URL. Well, that's where you could use a redirect URL, like a pretty link from the brand, branded domain, right? You could use like Pretty Links plugin to create a redirect that you could just link to the organization page, for example, in the meantime. And once the post has been published or the press release has been published, you would just go in, copy the URL of the press release, right? And again, from Press Advantage, you'd want to use the Press Advantage, the press release published on the Press Advantage domain. And then you would copy that URL and swap out the target URL from the pretty link to include the so that the target or the destination would be the Press Advantage press release. Does that make sense? So again, if you're talking about a single press release, you want to use news article markup. If you're talking about the organization page, it depends. If it's just a branded page, then you can go with organization markup. If it's for individual locations, which I recommend, if you have multi-locations, you create a separate organization page for each location. And then you would put local business schema on in each one of those organization pages within Press Advantage, if that makes sense. You want to comment on that?
No, that was perfect.
Okay. Let's see what next question was. I had asked before about which schema to use on location/city pages and was advised to use local business on those and organization on the homepage. That is correct. Would I use the ID page created with the power shields on all the pages schema? I'm sure Mark and Rob have covered this in Heavy Hitter Club. Yeah. So again, very similar to what I was talking about with the Press Advantage stuff. If you have multi-locations, then what I would do is for each individual location, I like to have a separate ID page, right? So each location has its own ID page. And so for that, within local business structured data, the add ID designation would be that specific ID page for that specific location, right? So again, if you've got a drive stack and you're going out, the way that I do it now for multi-location businesses is I create the drive, or I order it from MGYB to have the drive stack, the initial drive stack and G site built around the brand name only. I don't even associate a keyword with it anymore on the top level when it's a multi-location business. I have the brand name only as the top level drive stack. And then what I do is for each location, I had to order an RYS expansion from MGYB, which includes basically an internal page of the G site, as well as basically the build out of the drive stack, again, as a subfolder for that's optimized for that particular location. And again, that's the way that I do it for local stuff. You can use RYS expansions for different silos on the site, whether they're location or topical silos or whatever. It doesn't matter, right? But what I'm saying is I do the RYS expansions for the locations, and then I don't order the ID pages separately. If you wanted to do that, I think you can do that in MGYB, but I just clone the top ID page from the organization, right? So the top level brand ID page, I just clone that myself because it's simple to do, and swap out the details and then upload that to create my own ID page for each location. Now there is also in the SEO shield ordering, you have what's called a location shield, and a location shield will give you will produce an ID page for that specific location. So MGYB will produce an ID page for that. But why I don't use the location shields is because it creates a separate G site. And I prefer to have everything underneath the one branded G site. So that's why I use the RYS expansion stacks. And then I duplicate the ID page myself. Marco, do we have an ID page only gig in MGYB? I've never ordered it if we did. So
I can't remember if we do.
So, okay, well, thanks. Well, that's the way that I do it. I'm sure Marco has an opinion on it, but that's, the way that I prefer to do it is for each individual location, it has its own ID page. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and that's perfect and the way that it should be.
Cool. So no expansion.
Let me see. Yeah, I mean, Don, that's how we show you to do it. That's how we show you to work. I'm just reading this over again to make sure that I got it. Yeah, location city pages. Use local business organization goes on the home page or the about page. You can use either or, but not both, and never site wide anymore. We used to use it site wide, not anymore. And yes, of course, include the ad ID page on all your pages schema, or at least the ad ID node that we identify, if not the entire page, because that's schema. You can include the page. You can reference the page with it's not an ad ID page. It's not an ID page. It's an entity stack with iframes of all your company's information everywhere around the web. And so you can use all that information, reference that through schema. That's perfectly fine. And yes, we have covered all this in HHC, and I'm glad about the last part of that comment. He slammed with clients.
That's awesome.
It's always an awesome thing, man.
It's a good problem to have.